Well, that's a tough act to follow, two very well focused, despite the disclaimers, reactions. As Joe mentioned, I come from a different background than I think everyone in the room. My background is as a sociologist. I study inequality in school systems and have had opportunities to engage in several large-scale reform initiatives that have given me some perspective on this initiative. I learned a lot at this conference, as you would expect, since I came in knowing, well, nothing would be too strong, but I came in as a novice, and so I learned a tremendous amount. For example, I learned that a mushroom is a heterotroph, and it didn't take much more reading to learn that I am also a heterotroph. More importantly, I gained a great deal of insight into the principles of cognitive science and their potential applications for teacher learning and student learning. I also learned some principles of visualization, which I've tried to apply. I wasn't going to use PowerPoints for this talk, but first of all, I found that my two other people in this session were, so that put some peer pressure on me. But in addition, I thought I would try out some visualization. So you'll see I have one visual per page, and I've tried to use captions and labels as appropriate. Speaking of visions, I think there are two visions that are paramount in policy discussions and conversations at all levels of the education system, from the classroom to the government. One vision suggests that the way to improve the teaching force is to select the right teachers. And if you don't get the right ones on first blush, then fire the ones that turn out to be wrong. That's one vision. The second vision is to, of course, do the best you can with selection, but then to work with the teacher workforce to develop teachers as professionals by improving their practice. The second vision is clearly the approach taken in this center. And I think policy will increasingly move in this direction, as the other vision is not panning out so well. For example, yesterday, as we sat here, by the way, the Department of Education really ought to be able to give bottles of water to speakers, don't you think? Come on, let's get down there and protest. Anyway, as we sat here yesterday, this report was released. Were all those standardized tests for nothing? The lessons of No Child Left Behind. One of the key conclusions of this report was that we should intervene with rather than summarily fire underperforming teachers. Recent studies have documented effective ways of delivering performance-improving feedback to teachers on the basis of classroom observations. Recent proposals to systematically fire underperforming teachers are hopelessly naive. That's what it really says. This is a report from the staunch advocates of the selection and termination school of thought. Moreover, compensation incentives have received frustratingly little support in the research. So this makes the professional learning approach even more important, since the other approach does not seem to be working out too well. I think the work of this center also has increasingly importance that whose salience has increased over the life of the center because of a new emphasis, a renewed emphasis on science teaching and learning throughout our K through 12 classrooms. I was involved on a National Research Council panel that produced a report called Successful K-12 STEM Education, which has received a great deal of attention. This report was demanded by Congress in an effort to know what we were learning about how to do a better job of teaching science. And I'll tell you a story. It's actually a very long story, but I'm only going to tell the short version of this. Oh my God, a bottle of water. Thank you. Now, clearly this comes purely from Research for Better Schools. No Department of Education funding went into that. And if you read the guidelines, it says that if you get a bottle of water that wasn't paid for by the government, you have to say, this bottle of water was not paid for by the government. So that is an announcement. I'm not kidding, I read the guidelines today. Okay. Where was I? Oh, yes, telling a story. So the long version of the story do with the genesis and consequences of this report and its source in a demand from Congress and its follow-up in a new law, literally a law that says the National Science Foundation will spend $500,000 to see whether the recommendations of this report are followed. But the part of the story that I want to tell here has to do with a congressional briefing that I gave to staff of the congressional committee that demanded this report. And their reaction after I presented a summary of the findings was, it's disappointing that it's so complicated. Now, this is a reaction I've had before, many times. Now, I have an answer for it, which is that, of course, it's complicated. It's a hard problem. If it were an easy problem, we'd have solved it long ago. The reason we're working so hard on it is because it's a hard problem. And they took the report and they thought about it and they decided they liked it. In fact, they liked it so much that they held a big public release event so the congressman could take credit for my report. But that's back to the part of the story that I'm not telling today. Anyway, the point of the story is that this is complicated work, and we shouldn't expect any less. Of course, we would all like to come away from a $10 million investment saying, we've solved the problem, we've threaded the needle, we now know how to revise curriculum, to infuse principles of cognitive science, to elevate student learning by a standard deviation. Of course, we'd all like that, but that's a pipe dream. That's not the real world. That's some fairy tale world. In the real world, these are challenging problems, and they take significant investments to make any headway. And so I think we need to appreciate the work of this center in that respect. Now, I was going to say, I also want to mention, so that this report that's getting so much attention says that we need teachers with high capacity to teach in their discipline. So the kind of work that this center is doing is exactly geared towards addressing this challenge. So I think there are a couple of premises that we're operating under. The first premise is that to change the quality of teaching, we need to change student learning, we need to change what happens in classrooms. And the second is that we have many instructional reforms that have succeeded at a small scale. But to improve K-12 education, we need large-scale change. And that's what makes this so complicated. This center aims to promote large-scale change by applying the best knowledge of teaching materials and practices to the encounter between teachers and students in the classroom. What sociologists refer to as the technology of teaching, that is, the materials and activities through which teaching and learning takes place. These premises, that we need to change what happens in the classroom and to change K-12 education, we have to do it on a grand scale. These premises are a direct challenge to one of yesterday's comments that that these large-scale randomized trials are premature. I don't think that's the case. We learn a tremendous amount from this encounter between cognitive science and instructional reform. My former colleague Richard Lair used to make a similar point. He said, you don't build an airplane in a hurricane. You build an airplane in a wind tunnel where the conditions are controlled. But eventually, you have to take the airplane out and try to fly it in the real world, where there some days are gentle winds and some days there are heavy winds. How long would you have us wait, to those who say it's too soon for large-scale efforts? We spent 3 years designing the curriculum material for this study. Should we be waiting decades, scores of years before we try to implement on a large scale? I don't think we have that kind of time. And if it will really take that long, we should be pursuing other avenues to improve what students get out of schooling. Echoing the comments made by John Easton yesterday, I argue that research must not only be rigorous, but relevant. If we stay in the laboratory forever, then I would question the practical payoff from this investment. So I believe that this project, I maintain that this project was well designed and well aimed at bringing into juxtaposition elements of the instructional process that have typically not been pulled together, and we learned a tremendous amount from their cracking into one another, even if we didn't get the kind of immediate quick fix that our best fantasies might involve. I find in this research two kinds of implications for center researchers who, well, the grant may be ending in another year or two, but I would imagine you have a decade more of research to do with the data that you've generated. By the way, I think I'm violating one of the principles of visual, just a pure ethical principle. Anyway. So I want to get back to one of the discussions we had yesterday. I think there's a middle ground, and actually this was already covered to some degree in the first discussion period. I think there's a middle ground between focusing only on the high implementers and focusing only on the intent to treat sample, where we might look at teachers who participated more intensively and less intensively in the intervention and use quasi-experimental methods to control for selection into the high dosage and low dosage use, and see whether the high dosage people, the people who participated more intensively, gain more from, or their students gain more from participating. Actually, I think this would be especially appropriate for the teacher knowledge, the content PD intervention, because it seems likely that those who participated more intensively, if we can control for initial selection differences, would have gained more in their teacher knowledge, and so I think that's worth trying. What I'm talking about is not comparing people who went to people who didn't, but rather comparing the compliers, those who took a full dose of the medicine, with those in the control group who we might describe as would-be compliers. That is, people we estimate would have, in the control group, would have taken a full dose of the intervention had they been assigned to the treatment group. And we can do that because we know a lot about the teachers in both the treatment and the control groups. So that's how. So it's not comparing heavy participants to light participants or non-participants. It's comparing the heavy participants to those who would have been heavy participants had they been in the treatment group. That's the idea. Some term this the complier average causal effect model. Okay, second, this is the logo of the Context Foundation, but I thought it was a good visual to make a point about context. So contextual variation is also of interest. And here I want to adjudicate a little between the findings that Andy presented in the session yesterday and the findings that Chris presented in a poster after the session. These two sets of findings are not in opposition to one another. Andy showed some positive effects mainly in the cell unit, and Chris also found some positive effects mainly in the cell unit. Now, sociologists and psychologists differ in the way they use interactions. Sociologists tend to only include an interaction if they've got some theory that demands it. And psychologists tend to assume that everything interacts with everything. So Chris, I think, took a clever approach in the sense that he did I think we could call it a data mining approach, where he just looked at all the interactions, but he did that only in one unit. And then he replicated it on the other units. So if you find the same pattern on all three units, that suggests that the interactions that turned out to be significant are not just there by chance. And that's what he did. That's what you did. Another thing you might do also is to identify significant interactions on one cohort and then replicate them on the other cohort. That would be another way of getting independent verification that these interactions were not just random. In any case, what Chris found, what Chris's poster showed yesterday, if you had a chance to look at it, was that the effects were considerably larger outside the most high-need classrooms. In the most high-need classrooms, the effects on children were null. And in the other classrooms, the effects were considerably larger than the average effect. Now, on the one hand, that tells us something about where the program was having its effects. But on the other hand, that should be a finding of great concern. Because after all, it's the high-need classrooms that we most want to intervene. And indeed, if we kept going with an intervention that improved things for everyone except the most high-need classrooms, we would be exacerbating rather than ameliorating inequality. So I think adding this work is extremely important and is not necessarily not incompatible with the main effects that were reported at yesterday's session. Another sort of contextual variation that I would urge the research to look at would be differences across schools and a variety of school conditions such as leadership or coherence. I have a whole theoretical apparatus that says that school organizational conditions like leadership and coherence don't create classroom change on their own, but professional development is more likely to succeed in such supportive organizational environments. Now, my own research has not supported that hypothesis, so you may not either, but since you have the data, why not test it? The idea is that, for example, a classroom change is hard to implement if you don't have support of the school leadership, and if other people are not carrying the arrow in the same direction or rowing the boat in the same direction down the river. In our study of Los Angeles, we had the science content experts in the district working with teachers to improve the way they were teaching science, but then we had school principals with a whole different set of priorities and no lines of authority between the content experts and the principals. In fact, the principals had no incentive to follow along with the content experts, especially in the area of science, since their accountability was only in reading and mathematics. So that kind of disjuncture can undermine professional development reform efforts, and that was part of the problem that we encountered in our Los Angeles study. And to the extent that you have some variation in this within your cities, you may be able to detect that with your analysis. Next, and finally, with regard to research that goes beyond the center or beyond the set of data collected within the center, I think there are a number of implications. First of all, I think we need to do more to think about the system as the target of the intervention. So to the extent that challenges in the system, such as turnover of teachers and leaders, such as student mobility, such as competing preferences and goals, to the extent those challenges make it difficult to implement successfully professional development reforms, we need to think about the system as the target of intervention rather than the teacher's practice as the target of intervention. So in our research, we've identified what we view as the drivers of change, by which we mean incentives and professional development, and then the enablers of change. So given an incentive to do something different and the tools to do something different through professional development, what surrounding conditions make that more likely to succeed? And here we focus on resources, material, human, and social resources, so time and curricular materials, opportunities to meet with other teachers, knowledge and expertise from professional development experts and from colleagues, and social resources, a professional learning community in which teachers support one another in their efforts to make change and manage uncertainty. So these are resources that matter, and then organizational coherence and integrity. So by the way, that's the organizational chart of the Los Angeles Public Schools. It's kind of a mess. Anyway, so a system that is more aligned, more focused, more coherently aimed at a narrower set of goals would also be a condition that would support change, given that the incentives in professional development were there to stimulate it. A second implication for research beyond the center is that we need to expect more interplay between the field work and the lab work. So what happened in this project was we went from the laboratory to the classroom, just like this this poster that got passed out to everybody suggests. Everybody from this center team could be a speaker at this workshop about how to go from the lab to the classroom. But now we need to go back from the classroom to the lab. So think about the content professional development programs, for example. Surely, if you teach teachers a bunch of content, they get better content knowledge. So something that was going on that blocked that. Seems to me less likely that it was the process of presenting the knowledge, and more likely that it was either a misalignment in the assessment of teachers' knowledge and what teachers were taught, or that there was too much instability in who participated and who taught, and too much noise in the system to detect meaningful change. So this seems like a case to go back to the laboratory. Similarly, for the units, particularly not the cell unit, but the other units where where the effects were small, should we be going back into the laboratory with these units and seeing whether they really are fostering fostering greater learning under controlled conditions, as a feedback loop then back to the implementation. So my argument is that we need not only from the lab to the classroom, we have to remember to go back from the classroom to the lab and figure out where the system is breaking down. And then we develop hypotheses, of course, and then we come back to the field. Then my last comment was really brought out several times earlier in the morning by the other speakers and by the discussion that preceded the other speakers. But here I'm asking, are we on the wrong scale entirely? Are we thinking about this in a misguided way, thinking that through 72 hours of professional development, which to me is a hefty amount of professional development. It's consistent with other research that suggests it's enough to bring about change. But are we thinking about this in the wrong scale entirely? Do we need instead 4 years of science training for our teachers? Remember, wasn't emphasized much in the presentation, but remember that most middle school teachers are not trained as science content experts. Most middle school teachers have K through 8 certification and do not have science content certification. So are we just operating on a completely wrong scale? Are we looking for something else entirely? I think our teacher who spoke up in the previous session really made my point eloquently, saying that we need masters of the craft to implement these materials. And if that's what it takes to do successfully, then we're operating on the wrong scale of intervention. That might be testable depending on whether you have a few masters of the craft in your sample. It's hard to judge that independent of the results, and you can't reason backwards from this teacher was successful, therefore she was a master of the craft, and that would be circular. So if we had some independent information, we usually don't, because things like certification and master's degrees and number of hours and so on, number of hours of science instruction in college don't usually correlate well with teachers' expertise in teaching. So we may not have those indicators, but that's something to look for if we do. So I'll just sum up by saying I think the work of this center is extremely timely, is informative, has generated a wealth of data that will take years to analyze and fully exploit, and that I think there should be repercussions back into laboratories, as well as a new generation of fieldwork that involves it. So I really hope we have not scared off the cognitive scientists in the audience by saying, when you bring this work into the classroom, crash. But on the contrary, this is the kind of work that you need to do if you hope to infuse relevance into the valuable theoretical work that we see. Thank you.